This is the first of a two-part series on the Spanish variation of the Four Knights game. In this video, part 1, we'll focus on bishop to a4 on move 5 for white. And in the next video, part 2, we'll focus on the move bishop to c4 for white. Okay, so after the moves pawn to e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, and knight f6, we get the Four Knights game, and after bishop to b5, we get the Spanish variation. Now, the move I recommend is knight to d4. I mean, black has other continuations such as bishop b4 and bishop c5, but I like this move because it leads to very interesting positions. We'll focus on bishop to a4 in this game, but if we go back a move, it's just worth quickly looking at some of the minor alternatives for white in this position. Now, the first thing we should look at is the pawn on e5. So what happens if white takes the pawn? Well, it turns out he can't keep the pawn after something like queen to e7. After f4, black has knight takes b5, knight takes b5, pawn to d6. And after the knight retreats to f3, this queen takes e4 check. Now the main move is king f2, but queen e2 is possible. After the exchanges, black has a simple knight to d5, defending the c7 square and threatening a6 next. So going back to the position after queen takes e4 check, king f2 is a normal reply. And now black has to be careful about rook to e1 and pinning the queen to the king. So knight g4 check is the usual reply. Here white has two moves, and king to g1 is surprisingly the more common move in my database. It loses castling rights, but hey. But queen to c6 shows that black's fine. I mean, white has to do something about this knight on b5. If he tries pawn to a4, well, a6 will follow. If we go back a move, if he tries knight f to d4, queen to d7, and yeah, black's fine. He's got the bishop pair. He still has castling rights. So going back to the position after knight to g4 check, instead of king to g1, king to g3 is actually the more common move. But here we see queen to g6 threatening all manner of discovered checks. And it turns out that white doesn't even have time for knight takes c7 check, because after king to d8, the knight has to move. If he tries an intermediate move like knight to h4, well, queen to f6 is fine. The point here is that after knight takes a8, well, black's got the strong move pawn to g5. White can't take the pawn because of queen to f2 checkmate. So that's one continuation. So yeah, so instead of pawn takes g5, black can try knight to f3, trying to save the knight. But the problem is that after queen takes f4 check, king to h1, and knight to f2, we get checkmate. Yeah, so going back to the position, after I think it was king to g3 and queen to g6, actually the most popular try for white in the games in my database is knight to h4, hitting the queen. But after the simple queen to f6, it turns out again that knight takes c7 check isn't any good, because after king to d8, if he tries something different this time, so I mean we saw knight takes a8 and pawn to g5 before. If he tries knight to d5, well, queen to d4, threatening checkmate on f2, and if queen to f3, we see this move again, pawn to g5, hitting the knight on h4, and it turns out that pawn takes g5 check will be met by queen to e5, and if say queen to f4, well, black gains an extra piece, and going back after queen to e5 check, if knight to f4, queen takes g5, and if we just do a stock count of the position, so here white has an extra pawn, but the problem is he's got lots of threats to his king, and there's discovered threats as well. The king's kind of boxed in on this side of the board, He can try knight to h3, but then after queen to g7, just maintaining this this discovered threat. Then yeah, black actually has a better position. I'll just quickly show you a sample line. If he plays pawn to d4 to continue development, well, there's a couple of moves. The most obvious one is knight to e5, discover check. And if bishop to what's it called, g5, well, there's bishop to e7. and yeah, this is a difficult position. So let's say pawn takes, you got bishop takes, knight takes, you got queen takes g5 check, and the queen can't even block if king to f2. Then you got queen takes h4, which is a better position for black. Well, it's winning in this position. So yeah, so just going back to the position after queen to e7, and we see the pawn to f4 doesn't really work. So here white would probably have to play knight to f3, but again after knight takes b5, knight takes b5, and queen takes e4, and we see that black doesn't have any problems. I mean, a possible line and one that's been seen in a few games in my database is queen to e2, but after the exchanges on e2 and knight to d5, defending c7 square, and black's fine because he just kicks away the b5 knight next on with move and pawn to a6. It's just worth pointing out here after something like rook to e1 to just be careful and play pawn to f6 to give the king an escape square on f7 and to prevent knight to g5 as well. Yeah, c4, like I mentioned earlier, would be met by pawn to a6, which took a game for black. Okay, so that's one of the minor continuations, but if we go back to the position after knight to d4, and there is another interesting try for white, which is to play knight takes d4. And the point is that after pawn takes d4, white can play either pawn to e5 or knight to d5. Knight to d5 is a trap, and I don't think many of you would fall for it, as in knight takes e4, the trap. That's quite bad because of this queen to e2 move, pinning the knight to the king. Yeah, I don't think you'll fall for that one. So just going back to the position after knight to d5. Yeah, I think the simple continuation for black here is to play knight takes d5, and then after pawn takes d5, queen to e7 check. And if queen to e2, queen takes e2 check, bishop takes e2, b6, intending bishop to b7 to hit the d5 pawn, would give black a good position. So if we just go back to the position after here was knight takes d4 and pawn takes d4, rather than this trap with knight to d5, a slightly better try for white would be to play pawn to e5, but then after the exchanges of pieces, yeah, we get a very very drawish position. Black can play bishop to c5, and if white try queen to e2 check, the simple queen e6 should keep things equal. Yeah, this should be drawish with best play from both sides, but I'd prefer to play with the black pieces. Yeah. So just going back to the position after knight to d4, we've had a look at knight takes e5, didn't work after queen to e7. Knight takes d4 doesn't really work after pawn takes d4. Another try for white, and one that's played often, is castles kingside. But after knight takes b5, knight takes b5, pawn to c6, knight to c3, and d6, and black's fine. I mean, d4, and threatening to exchange on e5 doesn't do anything because of queen to c7. And if bishop to g5, trying to double pawns on f6, well, bishop to e7 should just be equal. Okay, so that was a short detour. If we go back to the key position after knight to d4, by far the most popular move in the position is bishop to a4. And yeah, to look at this one, we'll follow a game from the Belgian Championships in 1989 between
Dominique Campanello with the white pieces, and Mark Guinan with the black pieces. So in this game, black played the calm, bishop to c5. Is worth pointing out here the pawn to c6 was an alternative, but I quite like this move because it leads to very interesting positions. In the game, white played castles kingside. Later on, we'll see what would have happened if white had captured on e5 first, but I guess a lot of people would put the king to safety before starting to grab pawns, which is always a good strategy in chess. But here, black wasn't even bothered about trying to hold on to the e5 pawn and castle's kingside. And this is where things got interesting. Now, white had a number of continuations here, but he went, or she went, for knight takes e5, leading to a better position for black already. Now, this is a classic case of material. So in this case, white's got the extra pawn, so it's got a material advantage, versus time and initiative. So in return for the material, we'll see that black gets a lot of time and the initiative, which more than outweighs the material deficit. So after knight takes e5, pawn d6 was played. And now there are two moves for white in this position. In the game, Dominique played knight to d3, but if we go back a move, another alternative was knight to f3, which was slightly better, but still worse for white. It's probably a good time to do a small detour and look at the game from the Aeroflot Open in 2004 between Zhu with the white pieces and Pashikian with the black pieces. And in this game, after knight to f3, bishop to g4, and this is a recurring theme anytime the knight goes back to f3, the pin on the queen, and black's constant threat of capturing on f3, doubling pawns. Well, in this particular game, white played the natural pawn to d3, but then after the cunning queen to c8, we see that white had the threat of bishop takes f3 followed by queen to h3 with a strong attack. White played bishop to f4. Black continued with his plan anyway. But after queen to h3, bishop to g3, prevented black from winning the pawn on f3 straight away. But then it turned out that this wasn't good enough, because after h5, there was nothing the white could do to stop pawn to h4. So for example, rook to e1, pawn to h4, and white might as well resign. So if we go back to the position after pawn to h5, here white tried knight to e2, but after knight takes f3 check and king to h1, black found the brilliant knight takes h2. And the point, well, after bishop takes h2, there is nothing the white can do to stop checkmate on h2. So yeah, that was a nice detour. But if we go back to our game from the Belgian Championships, after the move on to d6, so into this natural knight f3, which we've just seen, white played knight to d3, but then came the strong move bishop to g4. In the game, white played queen to e1, but just go back and move. It's worth pointing out that pawn to f3 doesn't help, because after knight takes f3 check, you've got a discovered check. There's two pieces check-in, so white doesn't even have time to capture the knight or the bishop. Because they're both checking the king. And after king to h1, knight takes h2, another blow. The bishop's protected by the knight in h2, the bishop's hitting the queen, so the queen has to move. But after knight takes f1, well, it's clear that black has won the exchange and has got the better position because of white's terrible queen side. So going back to the game, after bishop to g4 and queen to e1 was played, but then came the brilliant knight to f3 check. Now capturing the knight was forced because of the dual threats on the king and queen. And after bishop takes f3, it was clear that all black had to do was either get the queen to g4 to deliver checkmate, or play knight g4 and queen to h4. In the game, white tried knight takes c5, presumably to try and develop this bishop on c1. But here, black even had the luxury of ignoring the knight on c5 and played knight to g4. And it turned out there was nothing white could do to prevent queen to h4, and queen takes h2. In the game, white tried pawn to d3. If you just go back and move, it's just worth pointing out that even something like pawn to h3 doesn't even help, because after queen to h4, well, queen takes h3 is coming next, and this is just, checkmate. I mean, king would have to go there, queen to g2, checkmate. So just going back to the position after knight to g4 in the game, white played pawn to d3, and after queen to h4 played bishop to f4, defending h2, but then it turned out there was no defense to queen g2 checkmate after queen to h3. So that was a nice game. Well, if we just go back to the opening position, so after bishop to c5, in the game we saw white play castle's king side before capturing on e5. But let's see what would have happened after the move knight takes e5. Now, it turns out that again, black can afford to castle king side, and then preparing to play d5 next to blast open the position. We'll look at a few sample lines. In this position, white's advised to play knight d3, but let's see what happens if he plays the natural knight to f3. Well, the point is that pawn to d5 will blast open the position, and yeah, white is ill-advised to open, the e file with pawn takes d5. Well, actually, pawn takes d5, for example, would be met by bishop to g4 with a very strong attack. But just to give you some idea of how dangerous this position is for white, if we just go back and move, if we just go back, let's see what happens after e5. So in this position, similar position like we've just seen after the pawn exchange on d5, it turns out that black is already winning, even with a piece sacrifice on f6. Can you believe it? This pin on f3 is crippling white. The queen side is not developed, and a check is bound to happen on e8 sooner or later. A few sample lines. Pawn to h3 wouldn't be any good because of knight takes f3 check. The point being that after pawn takes f3, rook to e8 check, and after king to f1, well, bishop takes f3, and the queen's gone. Nice. Going back to position after queen takes f6, the other try for white is maybe knight takes d5, but then again, knight takes f3 check, and again we see this bishop takes f3 will be met by rook to e8 check, and after captures on e8, knight to e3 doesn't even help because of this move, bishop takes f3. Ouch. I mean, if we go back 2 moves, king to f1 is also bad because of bishop to h3, and after king to g1, well, we got queen to g5 or queen to g6, with checkmate on the next move. So going back to the position after pawn to d5, we've just seen how black punishes e5 with bishop to g4. So the question is, well, what can white play? Well, another try here is knight takes d4, but after bishop takes d4, um, here white would have to be careful and play castle's king side, because after something like pawn takes d5, opening the opening the position, um, well, he gets punished by knight to g4. So we already see two pieces hitting the f2 square. After castle's king side, queen to h4, and here, yeah, white's in a terrible position. h3 would be met by knight takes f2. White would have to give up the exchange on f2, otherwise, if you play something like queen to e1, then yeah, we'll get checkmate very soon. We get a double discovered check, and if king h2, knight f2, f2 check, followed by queen to h1, checkmate. So yeah, if we go back to that position after, I think it was bishop takes d4, pawn takes d5 is bad, so the safest for white here would be to play castle's king side. But then after pawn takes e4, we see the black has regained his pawn. He wants to play bishop to g4 next, and he'll have the better position, better developed pieces. I mean, look at white's queen side. I mean, with correct play, white might be able to hold this one. So after bishop to g4, queen to d2. But I'd rather have black in this position. Yeah. So this is what would have happened after knight takes e5. Now, if you play with the white pieces, you're probably thinking, well, can this be so bad for white? Well, no, not really. So if we go right back to the position after bishop to c5, castle's king side, and castle's king side, I think the start of white's troubles was when she played knight takes e5. But if we go back and move, the correct way for white to play here is to play pawn to d3. So not going after material, but trying to complete development first. And now there are a number of ways for black to play in this position, but they all lead to roughly equal positions for both sides. Pawn to d6 would be a natural move for black, intending to play bishop to g4. And as we've seen in the game, bishop to g4, causes white a whole lot of trouble. So here, white would have to play pawn to h3. And after moves like, c6 is one of the main lines. The other move is knight to e8, but c6 is by far more popular. Well, white has a simple knight takes d4. And after bishop takes d4, knight to e2. With a roughly equal position. A few games have gone bishop to b6, avoiding the trade of knight for bishop, knight to g3, knight to d7, c3, knight to c5, bishop to c2, knight to e6, with an equal position when, black's going to play g6 at some point to, stop white pieces from landing on h6 and f5. White's going to complete development with bishop to e3, bishop to b3, etc., etc. So going back to the position after white correctly plays pawn to d3, we just looked at pawn to d6 for black. And the other try for black is pawn to c6. That's been played a couple of times. Intending bishop to b5, maybe even a5 as well, to try and trap the bishop. But white could just simply play with bishop to b3, avoiding any tempo gain in b5. And here, if black wants to, he can play knight takes b3 with a roughly equal position, but there's no need for the trade. There's no real need for the trade. He could just play pawn to d6, focusing on development. But again, white's fine after knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, knight e2. Just what pointing out bishop g4 doesn't really cause any problems for white, because it's simple pawn to h3. So yeah, so this I think is how White should have handled the position rather than going pawn grabbing. So just to recap, in the main position, in the opening in the Spanish variation after bishop to a4, I recommend this move bishop to c5 for black, because it leads to very interesting play. Now it turns out White is ill-advised to take the pawn on e5. Either now, I mean, he could get away with taking the pawn now, or after castling kingside, because yeah, black gets, you know, very good play for the pawn. So yeah, I hope you like this one, and please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And I hope to see you on the next one.